Hey there, this is Brent Arnold, and today I want to talk about how to pass information back from a view that you've popped off of the view stack. So here I am, I'm in Flash Builder 4.5, and this is I'm looking at the splash screen version of this BasicViewApp. And you remember that when you want to pass data to a view, within the pushView method, you pass in an object or whatever information, and that information becomes the data object for the next view. So here I've passed in the user profile, and I get the data, and I pull the name and the job information. Same thing happens here on user notes. When I push user notes, I pass in the data object and I populate it here. So let's take a look at this and kind of review what we did. So I'm going to launch this on the desktop, and hey, cool people. Now, remember, we select a person, we see their job information, and then we click Add Notes, and we can see their notes. Now, what I want to do is know what information I have passed or written. So, for example, if I edit text and I say, he's one cool dude, and let's see, I'm going to simulate the back button, so I click back, and then when I go back to add notes, it's not there anymore. So the reason for that is every time you pop the view, it destroys it in memory, and so you can't reference it to get the information. Now, there is a way to pass information back to the previous view, and the way we do that is through what we call the createReturnObject method. Now the question is, what are we going to do with this data, and how are we going to reference it? Well, if I look back here in my list view, this is the root view, notice that we have our objects in the list, and here we have a name and we have job. I want to go ahead and add another property. We're going to call this notes, and we'll set this to an empty string. Okay, so let's copy this and paste it in so that we can have this extra property on this data object. Now, another thing we want to do is, so when I click from the list, what happens, remember, I push the view and I pass in the selected item, which is the object. In the user profile, I get that object and I have data, and I get the name and I get the job. When I go push the user notes, I'm also pushing the same object to the user notes. Now, in this instance, let's set this so that we say text area text equals, and let's assign it to data.notes, right? That's the new property that we created. All right, very simple. So we're talking about notes, we're talking about passing the information. Okay, so when we have entered notes and then we go back, we need to do this override. So I need to add a script tag. So let's go ahead and add a script tag up here. Script, and here we go. Now, because we are overriding a method of the navigator, view navigator class, what we're doing is we use a keyword called override, and then it's a public function, and it's called create. And if I press Control Space, I can get some hints, and we want createReturnObject. So what that means is, typically when the view is popped off of the stack, it would pass information, but we need to override it so we can tell it what information to pass back. So what we want then is to return the data that was in the notes object, so the text. So really what we should do is assign the text that may have been added to the data.notes and return that. So I'm going to say this.data.notes equals, and then I'm referencing the text area person notes.text. Now you could do some things like check whether there's data in there. I'm not really concerned with that because I'm going to make the validation when I return to the user profile. And besides, if there's no text, it won't matter, because it's a very simple, just a really simple example. Obviously, you can do a lot more with this. You could pass back all sorts of data, but this is how I'm going to do it. So I'm going to assign that, and then I'm going to say return this dot data. Okay. So what I've done is I've updated the notes with the text that has been modified or entered, and then I'm returning that when the user notes view is popped from the view navigator stack. It's going to call this createReturnObject. Okay, now how do we then reference the data in the user profile? Because that's the view previous. Well, what we need to do is listen for a specific event that we can then get the data, so that before we show the label and text area and button, and I just pointed at the screen. I guess you can't really see that because you can't see me pointing. Anyway, in order to populate this, or we want to change something that indicates we've added notes. So there's a specific event called add, okay? And it's just a generic, add event, and we're going to call a method. So we're going to say returned object. All right. And so here we're going to call private function returned object. Okay. Then what's happening is here we can reference navigator, and we can get what they call the popped view returned object. So this is another property. And what we do is we check to see if this property exists. If it doesn't exist, then we need to skip out of it. And the reason for that is, remember, this add method will be called, this event will be triggered when the user profile is added to the stage. So we can't assume that it was added to the stage because we went from user notes back to profile, because the first time you hit user profile, it's added to the stage as well. So we need to make sure in our code that we handle that. Otherwise, if we assume, oh, hey, we must have been, shown up after a view was popped. Well, no, that's not always the case. So we'll just say if navigator dot popped view return object, and I'm going to do a real simplified not. If it doesn't exist is what I'm saying right here. This little exclamation point is another way of saying it's the opposite of true. It's false. If this is false, in other words, if it doesn't exist, it's a shorthand for saying navigator.popViewReturnObject equals null. It's just shorthand for that. Then I'm going to say return, okay? Because I don't want to do anything else. Let's go ahead and add the brackets just for safety, because I want to do else. If it does exist, then I want to take that and get the information from it. So the way we do that is we say if the notes string exists, then we want to assign that to the actually, I take that back. I was looking at my notes and I looked back. Okay, to make this simple, what we are saying is that we want to know, hey, if there are notes in the data object, then let's change the label. Instead of the label saying add notes, let's just have it changed to say edit notes. So now at this point, we can say if this.data.notes is not equal to an empty string, then we're going to say, oh, we want to reference the label, the button, we need an ID. So let's give it an ID. So we're going to say ID equals notes button. All right, now we can say, yeah. It's giving me grief. don't give me grief yet. I haven't done anything yet. What is it saying? It's saying, hey, identifier, before right brace. What? What is that saying? If it's not equal to an empty string, then, there we go. We're going to say if it is not empty, then let's change the label. So what did we call it? We called it notes button dot label equals, and we're going to change this to edit notes. Save that. All right, there we go. All better. It's happy. So what we've done, again, when the view is added to the stage, and it's specifically this add event, it's different than added to stage because it hasn't been rendered. But at this point, when we get an add event listener, we can then manipulate the data so that when it renders the rest of the objects, we can modify it accordingly. So we call this method returnedObject. Now we check, okay, is there a popped view returned object? If not, then just return. We're going to skip back out. We're not going to do anything. Otherwise, we check to see if the notes has been updated, and if it has, then we say, hey, there's notes there, so we're going to change it to edit notes. All right, let's go ahead and test this, see where we're at. And we're going to run it on the desktop again. Check the cool list. We click, and then we click add notes, and we say cool dude. And I want to simulate the back button here, so I click back. And there it is. See, it says edit notes. All right, very cool. So now when I click edit notes, hey, look, it's still there. Pretty sweet. Okay, let's review it real quick. It was pretty straightforward. What happened is in the user notes, when the view this has information that we want. And that information will be, we want to pass information back when this view is popped off of the view stack. And we override the public function createReturnObject, and then we return some object and it can be any type. And so that gets returned, and then in the user profile or the previous view that will show up, we can listen for an add event, and we can call a method, and we can check to see if this exists, this popped view returned object. And if it does exist, then we can know that the data has been updated. This data object that's been received, because we've basically passed back the same data object that's been modified, which then we can say, hey, if there's text, go ahead and change the label to be edit notes. All right, it's very simple. Obviously, there's a lot more you can do with this. Now, again, when we're dealing with returning the object, this is currently, if I were to choose a different person and come back to it, the data would be gone because we're not persisting the data. I'm going to create some other tutorials that talk about how to persist data across the app, specifically when you're dealing with if you've exited the app and you want to come back and you want to have, saving the state of the app, things like that. So I'll cover that in another tutorial, but until then, keep it real and be safe.